All right. So my name is Joel Jones, the moderator for this evening with the West Virginia Beekeeper Association. Our speaker today is Dr. Sing Knights. She is an associate professor and extension specialist at WVU. For the last 10 years, she specialized in the areas of agribusiness, economics, and management with the goal of contributing to the development of sustainable agricultural production systems through research, teaching, and extension education. Her work centers on the belief that there are enormous opportunities to increase the production and demand for locally and regionally produced agricultural products and to develop new market opportunities for agribusiness operations, serving local and expanded markets. She works to help operators capitalize on these growing opportunities while managing the resultant business risks. Today, she will be speaking on tips for grant writing. And as you can see, she's highly qualified to do that and has extensive experience in areas very pertinent to the West Virginia Beekeeper Association. For those of you who missed her topic on Monday, nonprofits and business organizations for beekeepers and bee clubs, I would highly recommend you look at the recording for that when that is available. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Sing Knights.
All right, thank you very much. And I think there are a couple of people in the waiting room, Joel, so you might want to let them in. So good evening. So today we are basically going to talk about grant writing and just some tips. But before I get into my presentation, I kind of want to speak to what you want to get out of this. So if you guys can unmute and just talk to me a minute and tell me what you hope to get out of today's session, or whether there is a grant program that you're looking towards, or you can type in the chat if you are prefer to do that.
This is Joel, and I forgot to mention for everyone, if you have a question during the session, go ahead and type it in the public chat, and Doctor can answer it as she thinks would be best for her presentation. And then if there's any questions at the end, there will be time for questions at the end as well. And you can do that either by group chat, or since we have relatively few participants, we can also do that by audio as well.
Yeah. So nobody wants to venture any information as to what you want to learn. Okay, so we'll talk generally, and as I go through, if you do have a question, type it into the chat. I'll periodically check those, and then we can go from there. But I do want to make it, pertinent to what you guys want to get out of today's session. So as I said, we'll talk a little bit generally about writing grants. And so I have some tips to start with. And then I do have a couple grant programs that I think might be appropriate for beekeepers and the Beekeeper Association. So I can just let you know about those, and then we can have a conversation later on. So we'll kind of take you through, some steps like the grant program overviews and developing your idea and preparing the proposal. Preparing the application, we're not going to get into that in the interest of time, and those are really, really specific to different types of grants, right? So we wouldn't necessarily get into that, but that's something that, if you're a first-time grant writer, the application process can be sometimes a little bit tedious depending on the grant organization. I am here to help you. This is my contact information. If you guys ever needed help around these kinds of issues, feel free to reach out to me, please. So let's talk a little bit about overviews of what, grant programs are generally and what is a grant. And I'll kind of look at, generic grants and generic proposals, and try to sort of spell out what it is that reviewers are really looking for when you submit grants to a particular grant organization. I have been fortunate to sit on quite a number of grant panels as a reviewer. I have also been on the other side applying for grants, and I know how that can be a really, really frustrated process. And I think one of the best ways I became a successful grant writer is having sat on grant review panels and really understand what reviewers are looking for. So I'll try to kind of give you a little bit of insight from the reviewer's perspective. And so just remember that, you know, the formats, the grant programs and so on are going to be different depending on the grant organization, depending on their RFPs or RFAs, that's the request for proposal or request for applications, kind of the same thing. Different agencies call it different things. Everything that you need to do is sort of spelled out in that document. So do not attempt to write a grant before you have really sat down and digested the request for applications or request for proposals. So this is something that I generally start any kind of grant writing program with, is what is a grant? And in the extension service, we generally get a lot of questions, and sometimes we get questions like, is there a grant to help me start a farm, right? Or I need to put up some fencing. Is there a grant to help me to do those, to expand my farms and so on, right? So a grant is not free money, right? So that's something that we like to get out of the way really early, is that a grant is not free money. And generally, there will not be any grants. So far, I have never heard of a grant that is given to people for you to start a farm, okay? That's not the purpose of a grant. A grant is basically money that they're going to give you for a particular purpose. And the purpose depends on the grant agency, because different grant agencies all have different missions, right? They are set up by the federal government, by state government, with certain mandates to complete certain missions, right? So for example, I'll talk about the Specialty Crop Block Grant under the West Virginia Department of Agriculture. And their mission basically is to advance marketing and research as it relates to specialty crops in West Virginia, all right? I'll talk about another SARE, which is SARE, Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Grant. There are certain farmer grants from SARE, and their mission really is to help farmers practice sustainable agriculture practices. So if you have an idea that helps them fulfill their mission, they are going to give you grant funds, but it has to be towards helping them fulfill that mission, okay? So addressing the needs and the mission of the funding agency really should be the driving force for your proposal. So again, a grant is not free money, but a grant is for you to help the grant agency achieve the mission, all right, that they are mandated to follow. So there are quite a number of programs, and as I said, I will end the presentation talking about some of these more specifically. So for example, there is the LFPP, the Local Foods Promotion Program, and that program is really meant to help promote access to local foods, but they do that specifically through intermediary business enterprises. So if you wanted to advance or plan or set up an intermediary business enterprise, so for storage or aggregation or distribution or processing, that would be your grant program. There is the Farmers Market Promotion Program. Again, this is meant to increase access to locally produced foods by helping the markets themselves, not only farmers markets. So some people read this as Farmers Market Promotion. It is not. It's read as Farmers Market Promotion. So any market option that a farmer uses to basically reach their end consumer, that could be direct to consumer, a retail stand, farmers markets, CSAs, agritourism, anything like that. This grant is meant to basically help you develop those, right? And as I said, we'll talk a little bit more about them. This is Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Farmer Grants. And this is meant for commercial farmers again, because they recognize that sometimes farmers have really great ideas about how to advance sustainable agriculture. And that information, you know, they give you that grant to develop that idea and then to share it with other farmers. The partnership grant under the same organization is also meant to help you advance sustainable agriculture, but it is a partnership grant where you work with somebody like a technical advisor, somebody like me, for example, somebody from a university, a state college, and then you work with a number of farmer cooperators. And again, the purpose would be developing some idea that's going to help advance sustainable agriculture and help farmers in general. As I said, the West Virginia Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, that's under the West Virginia Department of Agriculture. And I'll tell you later on that honey is considered a specialty crop in West Virginia. And so this grant is really aimed at any marketing development, any research that you want to do. So let's say you wanted to investigate varroa mites because you think you have some sort of organic solution to controlling varroa mites in your hives, and that's going to expand honey production, then this is your grant program. And then there is this value added producer grant out of the USDA, and that's really meant for any sort of value adding and processing ideas that you might have to advance those in the interest of increasing local foods again. The thing to remember about grants, though, is that the project must benefit more than one producer or more than one individual. So going back to my original thing that I said, we normally get questions as to, you know, is there any grant to help me to start a farm? Because that is going to just help you. There are no such grants. An agency is not going to give you a grant to just help you. It's going to help you develop an idea that will be beneficial to you, but that it has broader implications for other farmers, other farmer groups. So that's one of the most important things to remember. So let's talk about your idea. So how do you develop an idea? And that's the basis of a grant, right? You have some idea that you want to study, to execute, because you think it's going to be helpful to you and to people like you. And then you're seeking some grant funds to be able to do that. So how do you develop that idea? And the idea itself is really critical, right? But sometimes you have a really great idea. As I said, you know, that organic control of varroa mites. I don't know if that's possible, but let's go with that as a hypothetical idea. And sometimes people have really, really great ideas, but it's not just the idea. It's about laying out a plan that's going to make this idea successful in terms of what you want to achieve. So every idea, you must have some impact, right? That idea must have some impact on the issue that you're going to study. And then so the grant proposal is really sort of laying out, how am I going to study this idea so that I can get to that end point? Okay, so it's kind of laying out a formula, a recipe for getting that idea executed. And so one of the good things about ideas is that, you know, maybe a lot of people have had it, maybe they've tried it before it's failed, maybe you want to put a different spin on it. So it's really about seeing what everybody else is seeing, but thinking in a way that nobody else is thinking. Let me approach it this way, right? So that's a really important underlying concept behind that idea. And, you know, and generally an organization is not going to fund a high risk idea. So there are some bad ideas, right? Some things that are just bad to start with, not a good idea. Things that have been tried and it's failed and tried and failed multiple times. Well-worn concept, people have done it already. And so here's the other thing about a grant. if, for example, in the Northeast, different organizations have given money to study varroa mites, and let's say we've come up with an effective control, chances are that idea has been well worn out, right? It's been tried, it's been successful, and the idea behind giving giving 1 or 2 farmers money to be able to do this is that other people can benefit. So they're not going to give you, because you're in West Virginia and the other studies were in Maine and New Hampshire, unless you can show that West Virginia is so completely different from these other places that the controls or the, whatever they came up with cannot be replicated, cannot be applied here, right? They will not give you additional funds to study the same thing, okay? Sometimes they require you can apply for a small amount of money to sort of do like a baseline study, and that's going to provide supporting data for doing things on a bigger scale. So if you have no supporting data, is something that is an idea that's completely innovative, it's new, it's novel, you probably want to apply for sort of what they would call a planning grant to make sure that you are kind of getting that baseline information, and then use that baseline study to apply for a bigger grant. So whenever you're doing a grant, you want to make sure that you're putting it, you are presenting this idea in the most novel, unique, that this idea is novel, is unique. Nobody has done this before, or nobody has done it in the way I am proposing to do it. Okay, so you have to convince them that you were the first. This is the first of a study of this kind, because as I said, they're not going to give you information, they're not going to give you money to repeat studies to come up with the same information, right? So you have to be first. So I generally ask people this. Who was the third person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean? Do you guys know? You can type it in the chat. Do you know who that person is? Let me see. I just have a chat here. Hold on, let me grab it. Come on. I know I see one. Give me a minute. My computer isn't cooperating right now. Come on. There we go. Okay, I'll come to that question in the chat here in a minute. So nobody knows who was the third person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean? Okay, how about who was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean? Everybody knows that, right? That's Amelia Earhart. And she was actually the third person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Nobody cares who the third person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean is, but people are certainly concerned, people want to know who the first woman was, right? So you always have to find a way to coin your idea in that, but that being first, okay? So Kevin has a question. So let me take a pause there and answer Kevin's question. He said, earlier, while consulting with a patent and trademark attorney, I was asked if I had a DUNS number and was told that it's very important when it comes to getting funds. The firm he is with uses it as a criteria for their client vetting process. Is a DUNS number important when applying for grants, and are there any tools to be aware of, like DUNS number, to help get grant proposal approved? So a DUNS number is sort of like, it's just an identifier number, and actually I should have taken that to post that, because there are many fraudulent sites out there, and this is what you have to be very careful about when applying for a DUNS number, right? There are many fraudulent sites out there that asks you to pay for a DUNS number. You never have to pay for a DUNS number. A DUNS number, if it's done through the correct site, is free of charge, and I should post that. But it's just an identifier number. Generally, a lot of applications, if they're going to let's say the USDA, the FDA, those kinds of agencies, they're going to require you to have that identifier number. That way they can track, because remember, they're going to have to track, your expenses and so on, and that's the way that they track you. And incidentally, this is something that people should be aware of when it comes to grant funding. So let's say you apply to an agency for $20,000 grant, and they say, "Oh wow, Kevin, you have successfully been granted this $20,000." $20,000 does not appear as a check in the mail. Okay, so generally what most grant programs do is they require you to spend the money as per your budget to execute your project, and then the grant agency is going to refund or reimburse your expenses. So you don't get a big chunk of money in the mail and then use that to carry out your project. You have to have the funds up front in order to execute the project, and then you get reimbursed. And so this DUNS number, right, is one of those things that they use to identify you. And so you are going to, submit your expenses and your receipts and so on to the agency, and then they're going to reimburse you. And so they won't call you Kevin, but they will identify you by that DUNS number. Okay, so very good question. All right, so make yourself first in whatever category you choose. Show that your idea is novel, because that's what they want to fund. They want to fund novel ideas, right? Another thing with when you're doing grant programs, I did this when I just started out. I promised the world, and I always said, oh, if I ask for less money, chances are they're going to look favorably on that, and then they're going to give me the grant. And then a reviewer will say, that is not realistic. You can't promise the world on this little budget, right? So a grant reviewer wants you to be realistic, and they want you to be objective. And they're going to look at the scope of work that you're proposing to do under this grant. And then they're going to look at the budget, and they're going to say, well, are you asking for a reasonable amount to be able to execute this project successfully? So don't shoot yourself in the foot by asking for too little money, and don't shoot yourself in the foot by being overly ambitious in terms of your grant, the scope of work under the grant. Promise what you think you can deliver, and then you might want to over deliver, right? That's good. Or just deliver what you promise. That's good too. But ask for sufficient money to be able to execute that. And sometimes when people come up with these ideas, it's a good place to start with, okay, what is this going to cost me? What are the things that I absolutely need to execute? How much will this cost? And then go back and kind of develop the body of the grant. All right. So I have this little cartoon. Why do you say that your coffee is second best? And this girl says, everybody else says theirs is the best. We don't want to exaggerate. It's okay to exaggerate and say what you're going to do and why you think this is novel, but don't over exaggerate. Don't over promise. Okay. So let's talk about the proposal itself. And so remember I said that every RFA or RFP, request for proposal or request for application, is going to ask you for specific things. So you must refer to the proposal, right? But there are a lot of different reasons why applications fail, right? Okay, so I'll come to your question in a minute. So we have one more question in the queue. But applications fail for a number of reasons. A lot of people, when you start writing a grant, the deadline is Friday, right? So the 9th, and then they're going to start writing the grant today. Doesn't work. That's why they give you at least 45 days. They announce the grant before the deadline, because it really does take. You have to write the grant, and you have to rewrite it, and you have to write it a final time. Okay, now it's a good idea to have people look over it. So lack of time, lack of commitment, you get halfway into it and you're like, that's way too much. Your problem is not important, or it's not important enough, or it's not important to that grant agency. you have to be, your idea and the problem you're working on has to be relevant. So you have to, prove that there is a need for what you want to study, and then that need has to fit in with the mission of that grant agency. Your problem might be relevant, your idea might be good, but you're not rationalizing this in terms of saying there is a need for this study. You can't just say there's a need for this. You have to show, you have to talk to people. You might have, as I said before, some baseline data, right? Insufficient knowledge of the literature. You don't know what's going on. You don't know if it's been studied before and so on. So certain grant agencies, in fact, one of the grant agencies I know, on their website, they generally have a list of all the previous projects that they have funded. That way you can look at it and say, has my idea been studied before? Now, even if it has been studied before, it may not have been studied in the way you are proposing to study it, right? So you have to look at what there is, what has been done before, what has been funded before, and try to make sure that you're not replicating exactly what has been studied before. You can take a different spin on it, right? Lack of essential experience of applicants. So again, you might be a good beekeeper and you might have an idea, as I said, to do this varroa mite study, and you might be really good at that, and you're applying for a farmer grant. So apart from being able to execute the work, remember, they're going to give you money, okay? They're going to give you money, and they want to know that you are able to manage this money to do and to deliver on what you said for the grant agency. So that's why sometimes it's a good idea. For example, when anybody from the university applies for a grant, we don't see the money, I do something, I have a receipt, I submit my receipt to what we call the Office of Sponsored Programs. We have a whole group of people that does all the fiscal management, handles the receipt and handles the payment from the organization. We don't do any of that. And the university has the credibility to be able to do that as a fiscal office, right? They want to know, and that's when you do that DUNS application that Kevin was talking about. They ask you certain questions like that to ensure that you are fiscally responsible to handle, if it's 10,000 or 20,000 or 50,000 or 100,000, however much money they're giving you, okay? And so that's why generally when people are applying for grants, they do that through an organization or an agency that might have a little bit more credibility in handling that sort of fiscal responsibility, right? And so there is a whole lot of other things. You didn't follow the instructions. I have seen really good grants as a reviewer get thrown out because they asked you for one of the required documents might have been CVs of people or a management plan, or they ask you something as simple as the cap is 20,000 and you send in a budget for 25,000, or you send in a budget for $20,200. You didn't follow the instructions, they're going to toss that out, right? So simple things. If they ask you for 10 pages of narrative and you do 10.5 pages, you get knocked out because you did not follow the instructions. So those are really simple things, right? You are proposing an unrealistic amount of work. As I said, you're overly ambitious. You're uncertain about the outcome. So you want to do this, but I'm not sure how this is going to turn out. You have to know what it is you're planning to do, right? And so on, and so forth. You have a reader unfriendly application. Sometimes, remember, reviewers are real people. It's kind of like, remember back to your days in school, right? If your handwriting was atrocious and you didn't really take very good care to write your essay and you had a number of grammar errors and spelling errors and all of that kind of thing days before spell check, your teacher would have a hard time correcting your assignments, and most likely when you piss the teachers off, you know, they're kind of, your grade will suffer, right? So too with reviewers, right? Reviewers are only people, and so to look favorably on your grant, I hate to say this, but it should be reader friendly, okay? Highlight certain things you want to stand out, make it stick to the font that they're asking, separate things into paragraph, use tables when you can, use bullets and sub-bullets and so on. Just like you learned when you were doing your essays in high school, right? So all of those kinds of things. One important thing is it's not relevant to the agency's mission. Make sure that you are, you know, aligning what you want to study with the organization's mission. Okay, so I have a question in the chat. Let me take it. So it starts off with, if this question does not fit your presentation, don't worry about answering. So it says there are a few programs out there for citizen scientists that are volunteers to collect data from their own bee yards for use by academic researchers, which sometimes requires purchasing equipment or software. For beekeepers that are not necessarily idea people applying for their own grants, but want to participate in research or projects that others are undertaking, where would be a place to start to identify those sort of projects or grants? Could the Extension Office assist? And that's precisely where you would start, right? Start with your extension agent. You know, I'm putting myself out there. Please call me. I'll talk about the Northeast SARE projects again, and I am the Northeast SARE state coordinator for West Virginia. So it would be good if we have, you know, so generally they wouldn't necessarily give the grants to the citizens, as you pointed out here, but maybe somebody who is sort of tallying all of that research data from the different citizen scientists, right? So extension agents will be a good place to start. They can direct you to, you know, other people that might likely be doing similar research and might be looking for citizen scientists, right? So yeah, so reach out to your extension office, reach out to me, and we'd be happy to point you in the right direction. Good question again. All right, so this is just a little bit about, you know, so when you're talking about your proposal, you want to think about, you know, that vision, that purpose. What are you hoping to do, right, with this grant? And again, it should be relevant. There should be a problem that you're addressing, okay? And that problem should have an ultimate impact. So what do you think is the broad outcome? Your purpose, your vision, so it's broad, right? You want to increase honeybee populations in West Virginia, or the number of beekeepers in West Virginia. That's your overall purpose. That's your end goal. That's the impact, right? So I shouldn't use the word goal. That's your vision. So that's what your ultimate impact is going to be. And then your goals would be, okay, so this is what I want to do. I want to increase the number of beekeepers. I want to increase honeybee populations. I can do that in different ways. So what are the specific ways, the what I'm going to do? So we're going to break up this overall vision into some smaller goals. And then my objectives, now I have to say, okay, well, how am I going to achieve these goals? So now this is the how, you know, precisely how am I going to do this, right? So you must have some strategies there. And very importantly, how will you know when it's done? How will you know when you achieve your objective? You have to have some metric, some sort of, you know, items that you're going to count that is going to tell you, these are my measurements, right? These are the things I'm going to measure to show that I have achieved my objective. And so it's a good idea to kind of lay this out, you know, in sort of like a schematic, and then start writing the proposal, putting it together, right? Every proposal, every request for proposals has these breakouts. There's scoring criteria, or you can call it a rubric if you want. And each one of these, you know, there are certain points attached. and the number of points, and they will tell you, you know, in terms of the approach, what they want X, Y, and Z. When you're talking about the purpose, we want to see a statement of need. We want to see a rationale. We want to see who the beneficiaries would be. We want to see what the overall impact would be. They will spell out exactly what they want you to do under each of these topics, right? And then this is how the reviewers will score it. So just like in an exam, you have 20 points you can earn for purpose. So did you explain the purpose, and are you convincing enough, right? So in terms of, we'll kind of go through these really quickly. Let me check my time. Yeah. So, you know, in terms of the purpose, you will kind of have to spell out the critical need. What is the need? You will only be given grant funds if you're solving some problem out there. So there has to be a problem, there has to be a critical need, and then your solution, you should be able to convince the grant reviewers that the solution you're proposing is going to help solve that critical need. And again, as I said, it must align with the agency's mission and goals. And does the outcome benefit the intended audience, or does it just benefit you, the grant writer, right? It has to benefit an audience, and it has to benefit a number of people. It can't benefit 2 people in West Virginia, because if they're giving you $20,000, right, that boils down to they're spending $10,000 per person to have whatever outcome you're planning. That's kind of how they look at the value for money. What is the outcome and how many people versus what they're spending? So you want to make sure so I won't bother to go into that. I will make, and I think Joel and they have some mechanism for making these proposals available to you, so you can read through this. It's just a little example, okay? The approach, right? So as I said, you know, the goals and the objectives, that's kind of where you lay this out, and they really want to see that you know, it's making sense what you're proposing. You have to say who are the people who's going to be involved, and are they qualified to do what you are proposing to do, right? And so who's your project team? Is the project team just you? And so generally, grant agencies don't like to see a single person on a grant, because, you know, what if something happened to you? The grant is not going to be successful, right? So generally, you have a project team. And, you know, if you say you're having partnerships, are the partnerships appropriate for what you're proposing to do? The budget, really important. Make sure it's reasonable. Make sure what you're asking for is allowable. A lot of times, most grants will not give you money to purchase what they call capital items, any machinery, any equipment that is not related to the grant. If you are studying a particular problem and you need a specific piece of equipment to study that particular problem, right? It's specific to this study, otherwise you wouldn't need this equipment. Then sometimes that's allowable, but you have to justify that, okay? Other things, you know, the total budget has to correlate with the scope of work that you're intending to do under this project, right? And so they would ask you to lay out, you know, what you're going to do in certain things. So I think in the budget, you know, once you do that overall piece that I just showed you, the overall project, you know, your vision and your goals and objectives and your metrics, try and do the budget, at least rough out a budget. This is the step I need to do, and this is what I would need for that. This is the personnel I will need. This is how much I'm going to pay them. This is the equipment. This is my travel, and so on, right? And then work backwards and develop the grant that way. I'm sure some of you might have heard of a logic model. And this is such a nice way to lay out the big picture for your proposal. Some organizations require it, some do not. Usually if you're applying for bigger grants, they really require you to do this logic model. I can spend hours just talking about how you do a logic model, but basically, you know, you identify the needs, the problems, who, you know, the stakeholders, who's this important to, and then the, you know, the priorities, what is the vision, what is that big impact that you want to have, then what are you going to put in. So you will basically, you know, what are the inputs for this project, and then the outputs, and this is where people confuse outputs and outcomes and impact. So the outputs are, you know, who are we going to reach, what are we going to do, and what are we going to create. So these are just tangible things that we are going to do. It's kind of activities, participants, direct things we are going to produce, right? So these are our outputs from the grant, and you have to separate your outputs from your outcomes and your impact. So your outcomes are what is going to be the effect on your participants, your project participants in the short term, in the intermediate term, and in the long term. That would be what impact would your project have. And a lot of times, even if they don't ask for this logic model, they want you to elicit that information in the proposal. And so they're going to be looking for that. What do they hope to change? What awareness, right? What information, what knowledge, what attitudes, what skills do you hope to change? In the intermediate, what behaviors are you going to change the way you manage your beehives, right? And so on. And then in the long term, what's going to be the impact, let's say, on economics? So is this going to make more money in the community? Is it going to have some sort of environmental impact and so on, right? So this is kind of the big picture view of your grant. And I would encourage people to sort of take this template and kind of fill in those blanks. And even if they don't ask for the logic model, you can still present it, and then you're going to look like a really, really smart person. Or if you don't have space in the narrative to put this logic model, speak to these issues as you develop the narrative, okay? Remember I said they would give you a grant, or they would give you grant funds, but it's not to serve one individual. It's generally meant to, you do the study and you are going to help other people learn about what you do. And by the way, I should have mentioned that sometimes you do a particular study for a grant, and let's say you had some, I'm just going to throw something really hypothetical out there. So let's say you had this organic control for varroa mites, and let's say you said that you're going to use this lavender concoction to control varroa mites, right? And when you tried it, you know, you got the money, you got $20,000 to do this grant, and you realized that, you know what, lavender concoctions does not control varroa mites. That's important information. They're not going to take back their $20,000 because they pay you to do the study. Whether the study was, you know, you prove the results or you prove that that does not work, that is good, right? That's good information to know. Don't try that lavender concoction again. Try something else. So, you know, as long as you do what you plan to do and the outcome could be positive or negative, that's okay. You've executed the grant. But they do, most grant programs that I know about, ask you to do outreach to educate other people, right? And so they want to see, what is that outreach plan? Are you going to have, you know, field days and demonstrations and that kind of thing to help get information out as to what you found in your project? And so again, you know, the grants are sort of evaluated on all of those things I talked about, but then you ask yourself, because this is what the reviewer is going to ask, so what? does this project have a chance of being successful, and does it have a chance of doing what it says it's going to do, solving the critical need that it says it's going to do? Okay, and remember, generally when you apply for a particular grant, you're competing with a lot of other people, right? So you have to make sure that you've answered that question. So what? What is this going to do? You know, how is it going to impact lives? How is this going to impact the community? How is it going to impact the environment? You want to be convincing about that, okay? And then each grant is going to have certain eligible entities. Make sure for the grant that you are applying to, make sure you are an eligible entity. So if you look down this list, okay, you are not going to see an individual, okay? You're not going to see eligible entities being an individual. The SARE Farmer Grant is the only grant program that I know of that will give the grant to one particular person, to an individual, okay? So let me just show you really quickly. Do we have any questions at this point? We have about 15 more minutes. Any burning questions? So as I said, these are some of the, I told you about these before, but so this is the LFPP is what it's called, Local Food Promotion Program. And as I said, it's meant to increase consumption of and access to locally and regionally produced foods, right? And so it's basically with building these types of agribusiness enterprises or entities that would help you to process or distribute or aggregate or even store local foods, okay? So that's one particular grant program. And I'm putting these out because I don't necessarily know most of you. You might have apiaries, but you might have other diversified farms. And so this is, you know, information for you in general. The Farmers Market Promotion Program, again, with the view of increasing consumption of and access to local food, but in a totally different way. And this is how the missions are different. So this particular grant will be used for looking at market opportunities. So you could be setting up a farmer's market or setting up a CSA with other people, or a roadside stand, or an agritourism opportunity for your region, things like that. So totally different grant programs, right? As I said, Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, and this is the one, these, I will show you two of them, and these are the ones that I am directly involved with. So if you wanted to apply for a farmer grant, and again, these are grants that are given to individuals, and notice that the date is coming up. This is the only one which the date is close by. And I think this would be a really nice grant for anybody interested in doing some research or marketing or anything like that with respect to honeybees, that kind of thing. Please reach out to me. I can talk you through this, right? But this is to develop and refine and demonstrate sustainable techniques, explore innovative ideas that farmers have. We know farmers are wonderful experts because you're the guys there, you know, boots on the ground doing this every day. And sometimes you really have great ideas. And this is the opportunity for you to turn that idea into something, develop that idea even further, get some money to develop it. But remember, I said, you have to share that information. So if you have an idea and you want to keep that idea close to you and develop a patent and all of that for it, you should not be going after grant funds, because nobody is going to give you the grant funds to develop a patent that you alone will benefit from, okay? But if it's something that you would like to share, I really encourage you and I can copy this and post it into the chat afterwards, sorry. If you look at this, just on Monday night, while I was talking to another group of beekeepers, we had this webinar that really talked about the farmer grant program. So if you look at this, it really talks you through, you know, more specifically what it is and how to apply and that kind of thing. And I should say this, Northeast SARE grants, the easiest grant you will ever write is these farmer grants and these partnership grants, because they've made the process so easy for you to follow and for you to be a successful grant writer. The partnership grants, as I said before, is for you to work with some, let's say that researcher. So this would be a good idea for that citizen science project that you guys were mentioning in the chat, where you're working with another researcher or researchers in partnership, in collaboration, and then get to share that information. And again, it's to work on, you know, on-farm demonstrations, research, marketing of sustainable techniques, okay? So again, really important. The next round of applications for the partnerships grant will be in spring of 2021. Okay, the specialty crop block grant, again, is to enhance the competitiveness of specialty crops, including honey. And the project must address either research into production or marketing, or a combination of production and marketing, and so on. So again, you can reach out to the Department of Agriculture, or, you know, you can run an idea by me. I can help you to figure out whether it is appropriate or how to make that idea appropriate for the grant agencies. Those applications are due early in the year. So in 2020, they announced that like the last week of February, and it was due like the second and third week of January. So sometimes you have to be paying close attention to the Department of Ag, because sometimes they just, you know, put that out there and you have a 3-week turnaround for the grant. Value-added producer grant, this is an underutilized program for West Virginia, but this has to do with, you know, if you have an idea for adding value to products, right? And so, you know, like you have apples, for example, and you're going to turn that into, you know, hard cider, for example, or you have your honey and you're going to do mead, and you have some innovative way to do that, and so on. So another really interesting grants, and for this one, you can get some of those capital expenses, some of those equipment that I spoke about. So this grant will allow you to do that if that equipment is deemed necessary for that value-adding process, right? And then there is this rural business development grants. These are more for really big organizations that want to, you know, like you want to set up like an industrial park and those kinds of really big things. So whenever you get the PowerPoint, you can look through that to look at those particular grants. So I do want to say, so we have about 7 minutes, and I do want to open up the chat for specific questions, things that are still, you're still wondering about that I haven't touched on, or something that I've touched on that you wanted a little more information on. So is this going to be publicly available? So Joel, I can share it with you, and you can figure out how best to share it with people on the call.
Okay, yeah, I think there's a lot of good information on here, and I think if you don't mind, it'd be helpful to have everybody if anybody wants it. I could distribute it to anybody who wants it. For anybody who's listening, my email address is wvbasecretary@gmail.com. And if you if Dr. Singh Knight could share a version of this with me, if anybody would then like it, just email me there, and I can get that to you.
Yeah, so that might be the best way to send it out to all of the people that might be interested currently, and then maybe, you know, if some people wanted to be here but they were actually in another session, you can share it that way as well.
There's a few people that it looks like are called in, or maybe are not connected by computer. If anybody that is on the phone or not have the chat capability, if they want to orally ask any questions, they can go ahead and do that.
And I apologize for the fast pace and then the amount of information. I'm sure some of you might have had whiplash, but just wanted to kind of give you a good amount of information in this short time. So again, you know, if you think of questions afterwards, you want to talk about a particular grant program, my contact information is right on the screen. So take note of that and just talk to me directly. Specifically with respect to the Northeast SARE grants, the partnership grants, as well as the farmer grants, we're really encouraging people to do that. You know, if you potentially wanted to apply for that farmer grant, we'll highly encourage it. Because right now the number of grants coming from West Virginia is less than the other states, and so you kind of get a slight bump as applying for a grant from West Virginia. Do I teach classes on grant writing? Yes, I do. That's part of my Northeast SARE's responsibility. So if you think, you know, you had a farmer group, you'd like me to come in and kind of walk you through a particular agency's grant application and kind of talk about some tips for grant writing and so on, we'll be really happy to do that virtually or in person. With the Extension Service, we are allowed to convene classes as long as the total number in attendance is less than 25 and there is room for, you know, social distancing and so on. But certainly open to doing that virtually as well. So yeah. So Debbie, yes, the answer to that question would be yes.
Anybody else have any questions?
You're welcome, Debbie. I don't think I see any more questions. Going once, going twice. So Carrie says, thank you. That was great. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, again, you have Dr. Singh Knight's email address there, so you can always follow up with her. But we, Beekeepers Association, really appreciate your time for the last two sessions. They've been wonderful. A lot of great information. Thank you, and thank you for your work with the Extension Service as well.
Thank you so much. Night, everyone. Take care. Be in touch.